So I'm Sarah. You just saw me over there. I'm still Sarah. Happy to see you all and this really cool topic. So we have ancient wisdom for modern practice, how the 8 thoughts and passions through ACT move us from suffering to flourishing. And I'll just read the bios of our presenters. And what's funny is I've emailed Father Cyprian a million times. We've never met in person, and so that was fun. So that's the whole point of this, I think.
Amen.
So Scott, Father Cyprian, is a ROCOR priest, serving primarily as a hospice chaplain at Hospice Health in Louisville, Kentucky, and secondarily at St. Andrew Antiochian Parish under the supervision and guidance of Father Thomas Galloway. He is a board-certified chaplain through the Association of Professional Chaplains and currently working on his advanced board certification through APC. He aspires to become a federal chaplain and serve the underrepresented and often forgotten souls of the United States. And Dr. Russell Hall is an associate professor of counselor education in the School of Counseling at Asbury Theological Seminary in Wilmore, Kentucky. Russell obtained his Ph.D. in counseling psychology from the University of Kentucky. He is a licensed psychologist in Kentucky with a clinical career treating children and adults, specializing in trauma, internalizing disorders, and developmental psychopathology. Russell also co-founded the Van Tatenhove Center, Van Tatenhove Center for Counseling in Wilmore, Kentucky, and provides clinical supervision and oversight. Russell is married to Melody, and they have 2 grown children and 1 grandchild. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right. So it's been a wonderful day and a half, and we hope that what we have to share is able to fit a little bit into what we've been talking about with all the rich discussion and talks that we've heard. So I want to begin today with a shared truth. Suffering is unavoidable. Whether it comes through loss, temptation, anxiety, grief, or spiritual disconnection, every human being wrestles with the question, what do I do with my pain? Suffering is not a clinical issue, it's a deeply human one. And in our pastoral and clinical work, we encounter it daily. Our parishioners and clients walk into our office burdened by anxiety, resentment, loneliness, envy, shame and restlessness, and even despair. And often, these are not just fleeting emotions, they are chronic patterns of thought and desire that entangle and exhaust the soul. They are, in the language of the early church, passions. Long before modern psychology, the early church fathers, particularly Evagrius and John Cassian, offered a penetrating account of the inner life. They described 8 fundamental thoughts and passions that distort our capacity to see clearly, act freely, and move toward the good. And these 8 can lead to sin, which is the misdirected movements of the soul. They are responses to pain, fear, and longing that, if left unchecked, lead to spiritual and psychological deformation. And today we see these same dynamics in our pastoral and clinical settings. The desire for comfort becomes gluttony. The need for affirmation becomes vainglory. The ache of loneliness turns into lust. And the fear of failure collapses into acedia. And these are not ancient problems, they're human ones, timeless, embodied, and deeply relevant to the work we do. What then does healing look like? Well, this presentation proposes that acceptance commitment therapy offers a modern, accessible vehicle for addressing the very dynamics of the early church, the passions that the early church fathers named. And so, similar to the patristic tradition, ACT invites a metacognitive stance, teaching clients to observe their thoughts without being ruled by them, to anchor themselves in present reality, and to move toward what is good and life-giving. It's not an attempt to eliminate suffering, but rather to reorient the person through the flexibility and value-based action. And so today, Dr. Cyprian is going to explore the theological understanding of the 8 thoughts and passions as an important diagnostic tool in pastoral and clinical settings, and how this diagnostic tool can be brought into conversation with ACT, and that's when I'll come back in. And as a recovery for spiritual wisdom in contemporary practice. And so our goal is to help our parishioners and clients move beyond symptom management to reorienting toward what the fathers call the good and what we might call flourishing. Great. Oh, you're all right.
You got it?
Yeah.
Okay. If you give me 1 second, I need to log into this guy real quick. Okay. So we're going to stay on this slide for a while. I want to make prefatory comments before we kind of move into what we're calling the 8 thoughts, passions, or ETP, and then ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy. I will be using ETP as shorthand for 8 thoughts and passions. It's a mouthful. I don't want to keep on repeating that. So the first thing is just, what are some good resources outside of, well, the priest says so and the doctor says so, right? So secondary literature on this, Nathan A. Jacobs. So he has a podcast. He's scholar in residence at Vanderbilt Divinity Orthodox also. And recently he did a 6-part series on anthropology and meta-ethics and applied ethics. It doesn't specifically talk about the 8 thoughts and passions, but it does give you the larger framework, which is this slide will be on for quite a while. That's in the podcast series probably, I think, from like June and July and August 2025.
Could you repeat his name?
Nathan Andrew Jacobs, or Dr. Nathan Andrew Jacobs. He also has a bunch of published literature, and I will be drawing a lot of that as we get into this as well. As far as primary literature, John of Damascus, we already referenced that, and I actually need to grab that. So, on the Orthodox faith, there is a much better translation than this out there, by St. Vlad's, I believe. That's what I grew up with, so there it is. Some other prefatory stuff. So there's kind of a levels of discourse that we can operate at. I want to start at metaphysics and theology. I'm using those interchangeably. The fathers would have understood that as such, and so would have the pagans, the Greeks and the Romans. We separated that kind of starting in scholasticism, but really in modernity. That is what it is. From there, you go into meta-ethics, which is dealing with what is the framework for our ethical system, right? So you have the foundation, the meta-ethics, and then you have the applied ethics. How do we take these principles of ethics and apply them in situations? We'll actually get the case studies as such. Two other things. I'll touch on this a little bit further. It should be really understood that the church fathers are very pro-natural law, and specifically, they're drawing heavily from the Stoics on this. And so I have not heard, that doesn't mean it hasn't been discussed here, people in this room don't even know this, but a good anthropology framework from the Stoics that the fathers inherit. The first word is propatheia, and so that's kind of the initial movement within the soul, right, from the action outside of it. And that's where your blamelessness resides, right? So I see the cookie, or I guess the water on the table, it initiates thirst. That's a propathetic movement, right? From there, the choice, right, the volition is, do I start drinking that and ignore talking to you? Do I throw it against the wall, against Dr. Hall, right? Do I ignore it? What is my response to having that urge for water right now, right? And so that's where it becomes either kind of filled with moral culpability, right? So it's filled with blame because I used it wrongly, that passion, or it's filled with moral praise, right? So you have praise and blame with that. I used it rightly, I refrained from it, etc. So propatheia is super important. The fathers draw that from the Stoics. The West loses that discussion in the Middle Ages with natural law. So although we both use Aristotle, teleology, formal causes and all that, it is important to realize we have a Stoic inheritance that the Catholics and Protestants later will not continue on with. Okay, final thing, and then I will actually talk about the stuff. This system is unified, and I'll get into that, but I want to really make it known that the chain of being, right, all the way from non-being to beyond being with the Trinity and everything in between, it's one system. In the West, when you see the nature-grace divide, and that comes out of Augustine, you have two systems there. And you're basically going to have the Trinity up there split off from everything else, all right? And you can say, well, doesn't that happen with original guilt? Yeah, kind of. It more or less happens with original righteousness. And that's the idea that even before the fall, Adam could not be pleasing to God, according to Augustine, without original righteousness. And so there is this idea that were God to take Adam's righteousness away, by nature, Adam would be defective. The Orthodox and the Eastern Fathers do not understand human nature as such. Human nature as such is oriented toward the good, which is the Trinity, and is complete in and of itself. That does not mean it does not need assistance prior to the fall, theosis, to transcend it. It also doesn't mean that it doesn't, after the fall, need assistance to overcome its maladaptivity, right? But what it does mean is that we're not made defective in the image or the icon. That is a huge, huge distinction that I cannot understate. To get to that point even more, the fathers use the common analogy of like the iron and the fire, or whether it's the iron rod, the blade, right? John of Damascus talks about this all the time. And the point is that the iron rod does whatever it's supposed to do, right? It's a beam, and it does all its natural things. It's complete in itself. However, when it has contact with fire, which should be understood as the Holy Trinity, right, the divine energies, that activates something that otherwise would not be activated. And so nature is complete. When grace comes and acts as the fire, that iron can now burn. It can shed light, right? It is energized. And so it's the idea that there's a porousness between divinity and humanity, and that'll lead into this. Any questions at this point? Okay, I'm gonna keep going. So like I said, this is one system, and we're not operating on a merits, demerits, justitia thing that Augustine in the West takes it with. We're operating on this idea that all of creation is an archetype of the archetype, or an icon or an image of the original, right, etc. However, humans specifically are singled out, right, with that image of God. It is true that plants and animals, angels, etc., also are in the mind of God or Christ prior to creation, and so they're built off that blueprint. So in that sense, they're images, but think of that as a lowercase I. However, humans would have that uppercase I in English, so to speak. And that has resonance both in the Old Testament, but also in the Platonists. And so Plato makes this really insightful commentary that there is a substantive image and kind of a negative image. I'm not in photography, don't ask me, okay? But a shadow, right? And a substantive image is the father begets his son, the son looks like a father, right? We all kind of understand that. You can even see that with animals, right? The offspring look like their parents, etc. The shadow, however, doesn't have a reality. It just mirrors or parrots. And so when Christ, the whole Trinity, but Christ specifically, fashions us and begets us with our formal cause, our humanity, that there is a linkage there in the mind of Christ that is supposed to say, kind of as Father Maximus talks about in the previous conversation or plenary session, you're supposed to strive to become like that which begot you, right? And in that sense, while aesthetics are helpful for kind of getting at restoring that image, it's really, I can't become complete until I look at that image again. St. Irenaeus has the idea that you have the icon, and it can look like the fox or the king, right? And obviously you want it to look like the king. If you build your life on the fox, that's going to be the wrong image to strive towards. If you build it on the king, that's the correct image. So the point with all that is that the good at the top, the Holy Trinity, creates everything below it, and those are goods, lowercase g. There is the original and the likeness, and those are bound, like ontologically bound. There's one system. There is real difference, real distinction. Created things are not uncreated, right? But there is a binding there that you don't see in the West with the nature-grace divide. To go further with that, how do we get into what is the difference? And so this is where Aristotle is helpful in understanding that this whole chunk of created or becoming being has potentiality, right? And so we're subject to the ability to be, right? I could stand here, I could sit over there, etc. We're subject to change, motion, kinesis, right? And that allows me to develop different capacities. It also allows me to diminish capacities. This is part of the importance of the Arian discussion, is saying Christ is uncreated. He's not subject to change from his divine nature. That means that in his perfections, he can't lose his perfections, right? So even in taking on human nature, he can still transmit life to us. It's not as if at some point he got created, he got divine life, he can give it and then lose it again. The counterpart of potentiality is actuality, and that is the perfections we gain through participation in the good. From there, it's important to understand that, especially with this conversation with ACT, that with our focus on the Holy Trinity and the good and making these goods, value is ultimately found there, as in capital V, and all the created things are lowercase values, right? In one sense, they are means to helping us establish communion with value, or the value. We do that through both collaboration or cooperation with those created things around us, but also direct participation with the Holy Trinity, which is above us, and in both things in between. So how exactly that happens is that each of these things are distinguished on the chain of being, as in minerals are inert, they don't have life, they're inanimate, there's no spirit, so to speak, or living principle within them. They still have a nature, a principle of motion, right? That is completely passive. When you move to plants, they grow, they beget, they nourish, etc., right? So there's an animation occurring in them, and in that sense, both the fathers and the pagans understand them to have souls, not rational souls, not irrational soul, or yes, irrational souls, right? So not a human-like soul, but they're animated. You move to animals, and that's where you gain sensation, which is the direction for movement towards nourishment, right, as well as begetting and reproduction. What becomes interesting with humans is that we gain the faculty of both intellect and the unbridling of our choice from being necessitated, right, into being volitional, and we can self-determine. And so the ancients will talk about it as the things that are kind of up to us, so to speak. You see that in the Stoics. You'll see the principle of alternative possibilities with more contemporary freedom of discussion or libertarian free choice, etc., right? And there's a whole bunch of terminology in between. But the point is that, kind of going back to the propatheia, when something acts upon me from outside and I have a desire emerge within me for food with gluttony, for reproduction with lust, for money with avarice, etc., any of those 8 categories, I have a choice at that moment to say yes or no, and if I do say yes, why am I saying yes and how am I using this? Or if I say no, why am I saying no and how am I not using this? That is at my discretion. That's not to say that things don't become deformed over time, and pattern making doesn't happen. It does. And so that's where habituation really becomes either a hindrance because we've become habituated in vice, or a blessing because we've become habituated in virtue. But nonetheless, it will stem from what am I choosing at this moment, and how am I moving in my potentiality? I have the ability to become virtuous, right, with that water, or vicious. The final thing I want to mention here with vice specifically is that, again, it's not a guilt, merits, demerits system that you see in the Augustinian West. It's a corruption of the human personhood, right? And I think that's really important to stress in that it is not focused on legality or legalism, right, or judicial sense, although there is moments of forensics involved. That's not to say there isn't. We have a state and society. But ultimately it's, are you moving back to the good from which we fell with Adam, right, or not? That's the real question. Are you being restored holistically in all of your faculties, your five senses, your memory and imagination, your intellect, your will? Are you moving that potential back to Christ in collaboration and participation, or not? That's the good and the value we should seek. And so the fathers are going to really try to contextualize that. And so the final quip I'll put there, and then we'll move to the passions, is really stressing the use of so we move from metaphysics to the meta-ethic of the golden mean. You see that in Aristotle, but it's everything has a context, right? So you're applying eternal principles in a temporal setting. And so it may be appropriate for the 5-year-old child to eat one slice of pizza. It also may be appropriate for Mike Tyson, when he's preparing for his next meet or match, right, to eat the entire box, because he's a boxer and he's training and needs to have the weight on him as a heavyweight. You both need to eat. You both need to fulfill that blameless passion, right? But how that occurs is contextually driven. So I'll move on. So we've kind of hit that. I'll move on from there. So, there we go. So I know it kind of got brought up, cursor, I can't even say the word, on the fringe, right, in the discussion above. What are the 8 passions? So gluttony, lust, avarice, those are your appetites. So the soul, as understood by Evagrius, is broken into 3 parts. That's very classic in the Fathers. And so that's kind of your loins, so to speak. That's how they locate it. So gluttony, lust, avarice. Anger and sadness, the irascible, that's your chest. Vainglory and pride, that would be your head. That model comes out of Plato as well. Acadia or Acadia, I can't pronounce it. I'm very much an American, not a Greek speaker. That is a mix of all of them. And you see that in Evagrius as well. And so just to hit on it, when we combine them, we ought to desire the good, know what it is, and actually pursue it and move towards it. I'm not going to get too much into that. I think a lot of that is somewhat self-evident, just being one who has gone to confession at least once, right, in all of our lives, as well as working in mental behavioral health, hospital system, etc. I think we see this quite a bit. Questions at this point? Okay. Oh, you had mentioned where are they coming from? Where are we getting 8, right? So John Cashin, and I think it's Conferences, has an exegesis on the Israelites coming out of Egypt and into Canaan. So Egypt is understood as gluttony. That's the first passion. And as far as moving into conquering the 7 other nations, that's the other 7. You can ask if that's a chicken or an egg question. Are we getting it from the exegesis? Do they have it and are justifying it by the exegesis? I'm not too interested in that question. They are justifying it at least by saying it's there. I think that's all I want to say on that. Yeah, that's all I'm saying. Okay. So these passions, and I really appreciate it was said above, are neutral. They're blameless, right? And that's where the propatheia comes from, right? When you have that initial movement, right, towards reproduction, that's blameless, right? The question is, are you using that in monastic celibacy? Are you using that in a heterosexual marriage blessed by the church with your wife and at all the conditions, right, appropriately, or not? And if the answer is no, then they become blameful, right? And if the answer is yes, then they're praiseworthy. And you can use that the same with even avarice. John Cashin, although he'll say avarice is unnatural, he makes a proviso and says, well, I guess we do need some sustenance, or I guess means by which to acquire food and bread and water, right, at times, or to adorn the church, right? And so you can even say that, like, I desire, as Paul will talk about, St. Paul, to acquire wealth in order to give alms, right? That is a virtuous use of, quote, avarice. Avarice just being the negative, to use Father Maximus' language again, cipher, right? The passion is just the desire for productivity to gain material means. Am I using that right or wrong? So moving forward, I'm just going to focus on this bottom part, the bolded part. I've already talked enough at this point. And so this is coming out of Cashin's Institutes. So he's talking about Lucifer falling from heaven, right? And this really summarizes kind of all the great chain of being stuff. So this thought, he's speaking about the passion of pride, okay? This thought, should say alone, that's my bad, was the cause of Lucifer's first fall, right? Importantly, that's coming from within Lucifer, right? On account of which, being forsaken by God, right? So he separated from God, which is a forsaking, whom Lucifer fancied, whom he no longer needed. Lucifer suddenly became unstable and tottering. So he disconnected from the good, his unstable nature, filled with potentiality and able to move up toward the good or back down, tottered downwards, right, back to non-being, and discovered the weakness of his own nature. To be a little more technical, that's the tropos, that's the mode. The nature itself is never corrupted, all right, in the sense of like nature qua nature, or the essence qua essence, or the definition. The definition of a nature never changes, right? And again, that's where we're not nature-grace divide. You can't have a corrupted nature in that sense, right, or a total depravity. Rather, the nature, how it operates, goes down, and that's through the one's will. That's a bit of an aside, but it is an important distinction. And he lost the blessedness, so that would be the positive movement upward, or the tropos upward, or the mode, by which he enjoyed by God's gift, right? So that's the iron idea again. So Lucifer on his own has that cold iron, but when he's inflamed by the divine energies, he's able to be elevated to the highest heights. And that's the point. However, what separated him was this movement towards thinking that he did not need God, and that's what pride is, and it is ontologically the first of all sins, although maybe epistemologically it's not, as you'll see later with the fathers. That's a different kind of discussion. But that begets everything else. So this really hits on kind of all that stuff above. This is just talking about gluttony. We can move on from that. Okay. So Dionysius will focus on the bold. So when life, he's speaking about Christ, the divine name, right, is taken away from us, so you can refer that back to Lucifer or even us, right? According to the divine saying, all life fails. So everything collapses back into non-being. It self-implodes in one sense, right? Returns to dust, to be more poetic. And to life, even things that have failed, so this is reversing it now, through their inability to participate in life, when again returning, right? So that's that that return back up, they again become living creatures. And so it's the focus that disconnection leads to non-being, where the good is not. Reconnection leads to being, or beyond being rather, where the good is at. And that has to occur through participation. It occurs through movements, and it's a volitional thing, although we war with the passions within us to get there. A few techniques that the fathers hit on, that ACT will hit on. Nepsis, right? And that's kind of the being aware. It's the cognitive diffusion that you'll hit on in a minute. I'm going to move on from that for time's sake. I think this is worth reading. We don't have to get into it too much, but it is that golden mean again. The manner of fasting, a uniform rule, cannot be easily observed because everybody has not the same strength. There's a difference of time, manner, quality of refreshment, and proportion to the difference condition of the body, age, and sex. But that there is one and same rule. That's the eternal principle to everybody as regards continence of mind and the virtue of spirit. There's one eternal principle applied in different temporal settings and context, right? And yet the teleology of what it should be, where is this directed toward the good, has to be the same, right? So this is not a relativistic system where it's like, well, your rule's not my rule. Well, yeah, but both the little boy and Mike Tyson both have to eat food, okay? And both have to abstain from gluttony, right? The overeating and actually the undereating as well is a form of gluttony. Okay, and this should be my last one. So I've kind of hit on this a bunch of times. We are created to move back towards the good because we have a natural relationship as image bearers to that original archetype. Our nature shows us that, and we achieve that through participation. But it is a volitional thing, and it gets activated. So I'll pass it on.
Thanks. So according to the fathers, this reorientation toward the good isn't automatic, that it requires recognition and choice. John of Damascus helps us here by distinguishing between deliberation, our ability to notice and weigh the passions, and willing, our freedom to choose how to respond. And this distinction is crucial for understanding the passions. The fathers never suggested that the passions should be destroyed or erased. Rather, they saw them as movements of the soul that can be directed either toward the good or away from the good, as we heard a good theological discussion. So the teleological goal is, again, not to eliminate, but reorientation. And so this distinction opens up the door for a fruitful dialogue with acceptance and commitment therapy, which provides a process for helping clients and parishioners both recognize the passions and then choose value-based responses. First, helping the client notice the passions as they arise without being enslaved by them, deliberation. And then second, helping clients choose value-based responses that reorient the passions toward the good for what is good, healthy, and life-giving, paralleling the willing. So just as John of Damascus distinguishes between deliberation and willing, ACT provides a structured process for moving from mere recognition to free and purposeful action. And so to provide kind of a 10,000-foot view of acceptance commitment therapy for those who are unfamiliar with it, ACT's goal then as a therapeutic process is to create meaningful and rich life while accepting the pain that inevitably goes along with it. Its core principles aren't about eradicating pain, but about relating to it in ways that free up energy for more meaningful engagement. For instance, acceptance involves willingness to experience emotions fully and view them as transient rather than obstacles. And so the scientific underpinning of acceptance and commitment therapy, which we won't unpack here, draws from relational frame theory, and which posits that that we only have the capacity to really add things to our world. And God, in His infinite wisdom, when He created us, did not create us with a subtraction button, experientially. What we experience is what we have, and we can't subtract from that. But what we're left with is adding. we're left with adding. So from a therapeutic perspective, it's what can I add to my client's life to help them move in the direction that therapeutically they want to go. So the core idea is about changing relationship to thoughts and emotions instead of their content. And so this shifts the focus from more futile attempts to suppress or eliminate or try and fix emotions, so inner experiences, thoughts, feelings, sensations, urges, and memories that cause me problems, to build as the goal is not to fix them, but to build a more flexible, non-reactive stance toward them. And so this fosters ACT's core aim of psychological flexibility, which allows us to act in line with values when we are in discomfort or pain. And so again, the primary target is psychological flexibility. And so when we're talking about psychological flexibility, what are we actually talking about? This is a term that emerged with acceptance commitment therapy. And this particular article by Kasten really looks at unpacking what psychological flexibility is through understanding the psychological and scientific and neurological research around what adaptability is. And so with his work, he recognized that there are actions that take place in promoting psychological flexibility. And the purpose of psychological flexibility is really a complement to more static views of well-being. For example, focusing on positive emotions or character development or fulfilling basic needs like autonomy or belonging. The goal is really about emphasizing how people in a very fluid day-to-day experience navigate real-life challenges. So psychological flexibility is a fluid process. And so, for example, the actions that promote psychological flexibility is the ability to adapt to fluctuating situational demands. This is the capacity to recognize and adjust one's responses to changing environmental and interpersonal contexts in real time, ensuring actions remain effective and non-reactive rather than just rigidly habitual. All of you who traveled here engaged in a process of adapting to fluctuating situational demands. Your travels here, I'm sure, were not free of problems. We're always having to make adjustments. And so this is the one skill within psychological flexibility is to be flexible to situational demands. The second is reconfiguring mental resources. And so this process is about reallocating cognitive, emotional, or attentional resources to optimize functioning when initial strategies become maladaptive or just simply don't work anymore. The third is shifting perspectives and the ability to alter mindsets or viewpoints or interpretive frames in ways that better align with situational needs and promote more adaptive outcomes. And this is the one we can easily see very easy with the clients that come in. Most of our clients who come in or people who seek our services come in oftentimes fixated on a perception. We all have perception. We all have a very unique way that we see the things around us and the way that we connect. It's unique to us. And it's easy for us then to interpret that perception as truth. Instead, shifting perspective is helping our clients, and we do this all the time, move from perception to perspective, being able to see the problem from different angles and understand people from different perspectives. And so we use this quite a bit. I know that I use it quite a bit, and I'm sure you do as well in your therapeutic endeavors. And the last is balancing competing desires, needs, and life domains. And that's really about maintaining an equilibrium among conflicting priorities, such as work, relationships, and self-care, in a way that helps us continue move in value-directed manner. So ACT then looks at those particular pieces, and I'm going to go through the Act 6 processes. If you've heard of these before, it will be a review for you. If you've not, I apologize that we're going to kind of move through these quickly, but the 6 core processes that ACT focuses on that promote psychological flexibility and becomes part of how therapists work with clients in the room begins with the client struggling with acceptance. That avoidance is often the strategy that clients often use to manage the conflicts that they have, those internal conflicts, those negative thoughts, feelings, sensations, surges, and memories that get in the way of us finding solutions to the problems that we have. So acceptance is about letting go of fighting painful emotion sensations. Instead of pushing them away, we make room for them as part of the journey. The second core process is about diffusion. And this is about altering undesirable functions of thoughts and other private events rather than trying to alter their form. Now, this is important from an ACT perspective and really within third wave behavioralism in general, as a lot of therapy is about trying to alter forms of thought. A specific thought needs to change. But the goal here is really not about trying to change the form. We're working on changing the function. And so in order to change the function of the thought, we change the relationship to the thought. The next 2 core processes of ACT is about present moment. And this is something that every therapist in here is very familiar with. It's about a psychological contact with the here and now. Without getting lost in my thoughts about my past or always ruminating about the future. And all of us have used mindfulness type of strategies in session. The fourth one is selfless context. And selfless context is about seeing yourself as more of a container or space where thoughts and emotions and experience happen rather than being defined by them. So acceptance commitment therapy looks at these processes that move people toward psychological flexibility, but it would also say that these processes are not in and of themselves sufficient. It would say that it isn't that we're trying to help people change how they experience something, but they've got to be moving towards something. And so ACT very much then embraces a values perspective, and the goal is to choose to engage in purposeful action from a therapeutic perspective that is moving the client toward what they value. And a value is not a doing, it's a being, it's an embodying piece. It's the I want to be a loving parent, or I want to be a good husband. What I want to embody as a value, and that it works on committed action in order to do that. The better way to think about committed action is what's workable action. Our clients come in really good at unworkable action. They know how to do a lot of things that don't get them out of what they're trying to figure out. Committed action is finding those strategies that help them live into those values. So we have psychological flexibility, the creation of psychological flexibility as a process, moving toward moving toward our values, then from an ACT perspective creates flourishing. And another way that ACT often looks at that is that the therapeutic goal is to open up and to work at being present and then doing what matters. And so we can also look at these particular processes and see that they parallel aspects of what we're talking about with passions. Acceptance parallels Evagrius and Cassian's ability to notice and permit states without necessarily indulging in them. And we see diffusion is about echoes of Father's insistence that thoughts are not sins in and of themselves. One can step back and see them without necessarily identifying with them. And with presence, be present, the present moment resonates with our ascetical practices that cultivate attention to the here and now, nepsis, watchfulness as a skill. And then, of course, selfless context parallels the Father's call to see oneself not merely as a sum of passions, but as the image of God and capable of cultivating the likeness of God. And values aligns with the teleological, the movement toward the good that we're talking about, discerning good in light of God as the ultimate cause. And then finally, action really mirrors the Father's remedies: fasting, almsgiving, blessings, thanksgiving, humility, and labor. And so if we were to kind of conceptualize this in a different perspective through ACT, it looks at that when we are confronted with barriers, the interiors, thoughts, feelings, sensations, urges, and memories that begin to really bog us down, we're confronted with a choice. And ACT likes to think of it as a choice point, that you either pivot toward the pain and you try to control it, or you pivot toward your values and move toward those values in the midst of that pain. And we can see that from the barriers perspective, these are pre-passion moments. And that if we pivot toward trying to control, then these are the things that lead more toward the passions. But if we instead open up, be present, and do what matters from at least ACT language, then we're looking, that leads us to transfiguration of the passions, which leads to the good. So that makes sense? So let's kind of break it down then, and maybe we'll just kind of look at it from a kind of a practical perspective. Anything you want to offer?
No.
It's brilliant stuff, isn't it? This is brilliant stuff.
Did you want to do one case study and then do Q&A?
Yeah, we'll do that. Okay. So if we think about then, what might it look like then to use the passions from a therapeutic perspective, is to think of passions as a diagnostic tool. What passions are stirred in our clients versus what are the normal emotional responses that they may be having. Are they situational and contextual, or are they chronic and pervasive? Are the emotional experiences about avoidance, or is it about being fused to thoughts that tend to hold people down? We all know what those thoughts are like. We hear them from our clients. We even hear it in our own heads, that I'm unlovable, or I'm not smart enough, or those kind of thoughts that we tend to fuse to, get welded to, and we think of them as truth. And then to apply more of an ACT process towards psychological flexibility. Can I notice without obeying the passions? And then orienting choice toward the good through the values. All right. So let's look at it then from this particular case study. I think we have time for one. David is a 32-year-old software engineer. He comes to you seeking therapy for what he describes as frequent outbursts of frustration, mostly at work, where he feels colleagues often undermine him. He reports yelling at coworkers during meetings and later feels ashamed, saying, I just lose it, and when I don't get my way, and I just can't stop it. So he identifies as not religious, values fairness, respect, and professional success, but struggles to maintain these in his interactions. And so in working with him, we may recognize that David's behavior reflects passion of anger, which we would define as, at least from kind of a Cassian perspective, the desire to force the state of affairs to be otherwise. And his anger is not fleeting, it's more of a chronic pattern, and it affects his well-being and relationships. And so if we were to think about this, then if we were to kind of think through it as a process, we could see that as symptoms is frequent outbursts. I lose it when I don't get what I want. And this is a very simplistic process we're going to kind of work through. We know that therapy would be much more complicated. Leads to a differentiation process of what are we looking at? Are we seeing normal anger? Is it constructive, ethically neutral, or is it a passion? Is it irrational and harmful to relationships? And if so, then I'm looking potentially at the diagnosis of anger, a desire to force the state of affairs to be otherwise, which we also can recognize is connected to the primary passion of vainglory, which may or may not be present in this case. And so to circle it back around, from our ontological perspective, we see that framework that human creatures have rational, passionate, and sensible faculties. Disordered passions lead to suffering. Deliberate action moves toward the good. So the goal is to move our clients toward the good ontologically from that perspective. And so we can engage therapeutically in a deliberate way, if we go back to Cassian, which parallels Act's cognitive fusion and acceptance process to begin to open up to the experience, notice the angry thoughts, and then also moving our clients toward a willingness. And the willingness is about paralleling movement toward values. What does the client value? And then helping them to identify ways that they can move toward the values in the midst of the negative thoughts, feelings, sensations, urges, and memories they may be having. And of course, the outcome, hopefully, is a reorientation of thoughts and actions toward the good, flourishing, and then working toward developing long-term strategy of resilience, again, which continually reinforces our clients moving toward the good. And so if we were to kind of look at this just briefly from a different perspective, looking simply at anger, the one here at the bottom, we don't have time to cover the other ones. We recognize that to open up is about accepting anger without reacting to it, that it's part of the experience that I'm having. And helping clients do that requires them, oftentimes helping them to step away and understand that anger from different perspectives, to be present, to stay grounded without escalation, and then to do what matters, and that is to how do I respond to this moment in a value-driven way, even though that I feel lit up or I feel like I'm going to light up. And so it's about how do I tolerate the experience and move in a value-directed way. And so we don't have time for another, but we'll also kind of move to summary. So ACT offers a therapeutic framework that complements the patristic theology of the passions. It creates space between thought and self. It accepts suffering without avoidance. It reorients life toward values grounded in the good. And it enacts disciplines that embody this reorientation. So in short, it offers a therapeutic process through which the insights of the passions can be applied in a modern context, enabling clients to notice passions without being ruled by them and to choose healthier value-based responses. So in conclusion, our discussion on ETP and ACT explores the anthropology of human creatures as one moves toward or away from the good in conjunction with passions. And by linking ETP with ACT, we see a diagnostic framework for assessing the passions, and we see a clinical toolkit that ACT provides in redirecting passions. Ultimately, the collaborative goal of both is to reorient the human creature in the midst of their suffering so that they have a pathway for spiritual maturity. All right, that's a lot of information, I know, so thank you for hanging in there. We got time for a few questions. Yeah.
Hey, I was just curious, when you're trying to derive a client's values, how deep do you go in terms of their story, really digging deep into their story and who they are, and not just necessarily the surface of what they're presenting as their value system?
Yeah, that takes work. It's recognizing that when we sit down to do value work with our clients, what comes out of their mouth first isn't necessarily where they're at. And sometimes, especially when we're dealing with Christian clients, the values they often give are things they think they need to give. And so it is a process of helping a person understand themselves better and sift through whatever values that they may be exploring to understand where they find that deepest connection and in what context they find that connection in.
I'm just curious, like if someone says, well, my value is, like, I need to get as many women as possible. would you then try to pierce, like, what is the underlying desire behind that?
Yeah.
Because is there a way that betrays the process by doing that, or how do you navigate that as a person?
Yeah, so that is a further conversation. I will say, in all the years that I've been using acceptance commitment therapy, I've never had a client say that they have values that are nefarious in some way. Because again, as we've talked about this week, there's within us is to seek something that is the good. And I think that when the clients start to begin to really engage in those conversations, these things start to come up. And so that particular value to me would be a better discussion on what the client is trying to get out of those experiences. And from that, I think we can move to a better discussion on values.
Can I add one thing too? And so this is where St. Basil will talk about, he's being asked, like, Father, can you show us how do we love God? How do we love the good? And the response is, you already do that, right? It's not the idea that necessarily you're taking actions towards it, right? And that's asceticism, etc. But it is the idea that just like that piece of iron, you are naturally built and oriented towards the good in your value, right? And so you desire to have proper, conjugality and reproductivity and all that, right? Or eating and drinking, etc. And so that's where you can drill in further, etc. But like, we're built in that manner. That doesn't mean we can't transcend and have that elevated through divine participation, which is the fire aspect, right? But we are not a broken nature in that nature-grace divide where you take away the grace and we're defective immediately and we just fall down, right? And I think as Westerners, we often orient in the sense of, well, I kind of do orient downwards just by nature. And it's like, no, that might be your mode of choice, right? But that is not a natural inclination as God made it to be.
Good. I like that. Did you have a question? Then we'll move on.
Yeah, I just want to know so you get to the point of recognizing and acceptance, then possibly trying to reorient the perception based on the value system. But how do you get them from the values? What's the methodology from the value to like meeting the values?
The values to what?
How do you get to the point from, they've identified the values, right? They've done the acceptance work, the changing of perception, and then recognizing the values, to actually fulfilling the values, like an action plan. Like, what's the methodology behind that?
So I think probably the first thing we need to understand is values are not something we possess. Values is like a compass; it simply points us in a direction.
Right.
And so so it is a process of working with clients to in context and figuring out how to generalize it to other areas of a person's life, but finding the context where it's tough, and then helping them to orient toward the values in the midst of the problem. If they're having problems with that, I'm going back to diffusion, I'm going back to acceptance, I'm going back to here and now, in order to help them prepare more to live into the value in that difficult moment that they're trying to see. Oftentimes, it's a here and now experience, because that's the place where those thoughts, feelings, sensations, urges, and memories can really trigger us and derail us, where we move toward more trying to control it rather than living through it and toward a value. And a lot of times it's helping teaching skills for them to be mindful of the moment more, whatever that may look like.
In the current kind of just clinical landscape of modalities out there, do you feel like acceptance and commitment therapy is the one that kind of most easily aligns with the teachings of the Father?
That's an interesting question. Acceptance and commitment therapy is not a theoretical orientation. It is simply ask the question, what do people do in this world that helps them flourish? That's all it's trying to do. It's like, how do people flourish, and how they flourish in the midst of pain? And so it's identified 6. There might be more. Those might change, but their research is suggesting that these 6 are part. When people engage in these behaviors, then they're able to move through uncomfortable or suffering experiences and flourish, move toward a goal-directed, a value-directed direction. And so that's different from theoretical orientations that describe an etiology. This is where the problem comes from. This is how we work with the problem. And this is the outcome of working with the problem from like a structured framework. So ACT really does sit in a very pragmatic space that any language that a counselor wants to bring from any theoretical orientation is fine, as long as it helps clients move through those processes.
So let's say you're self-habituated into avoidance. How does that negatively impact your ability to self-assess and even like create spiritual deadness?
So the fathers are mostly virtue epistemologists, right? And that's the idea that as I practice the good or participation in the good, I become more illumined, right? As I become more illumined, I literally can see more, right? If you're fixing your eyes. And you can even see that in the one gospel story about the cleaning of the eyes, right, and restoring them. But the point being is that as I know the good more, I actually see more of the good. So you can think of it as, say, appreciation of classical music versus, I hate contemporary rap, just personally, which I would call degenerate mostly, personal stance. But so if I'm just in brain rot trash on TikTok all the time, right, versus listening to something like Bach, I have to train my ears to hear Bach, right, or Handel, etc. As I do that, I actually appreciate that more than the trash that's put out on TikTok, right? And I actually come to despise the inferior thing because it is so corrupted. And I actually, by doing the good, come closer to know the good in that sense. Does that get at some of what you're hitting at?
I guess being stuck in this loop of avoidance, and I guess that is to Dr. Paul's point of the whole therapy system in and of itself.
And that's part of the virtue epistemology built into that?
Yes, I mean, there's obviously diffusion there, certainly accepting here and now experiences. And I'm going to stop there because I know we're past time and I don't want to keep you guys any longer. If you want the notes on this, just do the scan there. Father Cyprian has outlined his portion in great detail, and then you'll see the parts that I contributed as well. And this will give it to you as just an easy PDF outline. So thank you. Thank you.